kick this off. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Jeffrey from Parker Dewey, and I'm excited everyone is able to join us for today's State of Campus Recruiting webinar. As everyone knows, this is like my favorite webinar of the quarter, where we do a deep dive on a specific topic tied to campus recruiting. I'm thrilled that Steve is joining us today. I've known Steve for, gosh, probably over a decade now, maybe
Yeah.
even longer. It's an honor to have you here. So today we're going to talk about leveraging data in early talent acquisition. We're going to explore why data matters, how it drives strategic decisions, and the practical steps to really embed a data-centric approach in your early career practices. And we're going to start talking about two different types of data relevant to early career programs, the data around the initiatives and the data around the candidates themselves. We're also going to draw out a little bit about what I call the vanity metrics from actually, I think, Steve, you call them the executive metrics and the high impact metrics. So again, you don't want to hear from me. Everyone wants to hear from Steve. Steve, why don't I give you a quick sort of 30 seconds to introduce yourself before we dive in?
Sure thing. Thanks, Jeffrey. Honored to be here. Thanks for inviting me. So, Steve Tiufekchiev, have been involved in talent acquisition for more decades than I care to remember. Most of those have been in the early talent space, which I believe personally is the best place of talent acquisition. So, for all of you on the call that are in early talent, good for you. I've spent most of that time in roles specific to talent acquisition as a recruiter, as a manager, as a director, but also spend some time on the university side, getting very acquainted with what career services is up against, helping career services understand what employers are looking for. Took some time off to help develop a company. Some of you may know Yellow, spent about 13 years there. And now using some of that experience to help organizations get a little bit better at this thing called early talent, and also focusing on conversations like this, sharing some of the trials, tribulations, lessons learned over the decades with folks that are just coming into the industry itself as well. So again, pleasure to be here.
No, and it's great having you. And as I said, I've known you for feels like forever in a
Been a
positive
while.
way.
Yeah.
And I know that when I was at your NACE session, gosh, I guess it was last June in Arizona. I mean, it was standing room only, talking about data. And I think that really highlights how much people are hungry for data, hungry for information, and looking for innovative ways. So I guess really to set the stage, why does data matter?
I think it matters because it's the way to determine if you're making progress at the end of the day, right? Think about something as simple as a fitness program, which I used to do a lot more when I was younger. You go in and, for example, you start lifting weights. If you're not keeping track, you can come to the conclusion that things are going well because maybe you see a little bit of results, maybe your muscles are getting bigger, maybe you've lost a pound. But it doesn't take too long before you plateau and you're not really seeing results, right? So when you have a fitness program, you're all about reps. You're all about figuring out what am I doing? How am I improving that? So taking that into recruiting, it's the same exact thing. It's really focusing on, are you going in the direction you want to you plan to go in? And if so, how well are you doing that? And if not, why not? Right. So data is what becomes the essence of doing course corrections, helping you plan. It's really about that. Now, all that being said, I will say it's hard. Don't make any mistake about that. Bringing and incorporating data into your processes is hard. I'll be the first one to admit to that. And I focus and I struggle with that as well because it's a discipline. But it's well worth it. There's a lot of payoff today. And I think what we're going to really focus on is programmatic data versus candidate data. Candidate data, incredibly important, but for those folks on the call who are leading programs or developing programs, this is really more about how do you instill or how to utilize data in the program, right? So to also distill it down to very simple things, it helps you achieve your goals. It's going to help you get in the direction you want to be going. It also, again, highlights the things that are potentially getting in the way of what you had planned to do. And it becomes the foundation on which to have a lot of different discussions with leadership, with your teams, because the data, for the most part, is irrefutable. If you've done it correctly, it's just the facts, so to speak, right?
Can I
So
jump
again,
in
that's
for?
why I'm a passionate of it. Yeah, please.
Hey, let me jump in for a second because I think you brought up a really important point that I want to double underline. So it's the data to measure where you are and to demonstrate the success of what's been done, but it's also data to course correct or continue to improve. It's really
Absolutely.
about both. Is that correct?
Yeah, oh, yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, by just, again, thinking of that fitness example, as you get into it, the weeks into it, the months into it, you're able to see progression, even when sometimes it means or it looks like you're not progressing. Because again, as you lift, for example, you have a quick couple of weeks where you're seeing lots of results, and then you sort of plateau, and then you got to work a little bit harder to get that momentum. It's the same thing in recruiting. If you do data, or if you integrate data into your process, initially you're going to see a lot of great results. But then as you've done that, you sort of move the bar up, and it begins to become more difficult, because now you're going to search more areas for focusing on data, bringing that into it. And again, it's that constant iteration of bringing data in, thinking about what you're doing, measuring it right, and getting to the next level. So the one thing I would say is it's also an iterative process, and it's an ongoing process. There's no end, if you will, in that journey.
So when we talk about the driving outcome side of it, because again, we talked about the communicating, but also the driving outcomes. It sounds like a lot of it is also about, are you being efficient and effective with your time and with your capital that you're spending and with your efforts overall?
Right. And also, I think why data is so important, both inside and outside of your teams, is it helps you communicate, right? If you've ever sat in meetings with other functional areas, marketing, operations, what you'll find is most of the time the discussions are focused on data, whether it's about how many leads are coming in and the conversion of those leads, or operational, a lot of times with spreadsheets discussions, right? So one, it gives you the ability to be on equal footing from a communication standpoint within the leadership organization, within your team, but also outside of your team. And I think that's an important point, because outside is organizational functional areas typically rely much more on the data. So it gives you a foundation, not just to plan and build and to measure, but I think it also leads to a lot of equality when it comes to discussions inside the organization. It gives you credibility, in other words.
Well, and that's really important because, again, while all of us are here because we fundamentally care about early career programs, the reality is someone in marketing, someone in sales or finance, or even other parts of HR, this isn't really where they're focused. So I think being able to communicate with them and show them the impact of what you're doing is just so valuable.
Yeah, and you said an interesting word, impact. We'll come back to that. But the other thing about this is it's important to understand when you're bringing in corporate and data into the organization, into your processes. There's different ways that data gets both collected but also communicated, and I think that's an important point. So I think this leads to a question, right? If all of this is true, why isn't it more utilized in our profession, right? In college recruiting. And I think the reason for that is it's got multiple facets, right? One is there's a lot of turnover, or has been at least recently, in university relations, college relations overall. And so there's a lot of new folks to the profession. And as a result of that, there's just a basic lack of knowledge on what the data might be, what the opportunity for data is, the importance of that. So that alone is a big factor. Shockingly, according to one study, it was done by Lighthouse Research. When they asked folks, why is data hard? Why is bringing data into the organization challenging? More than a third of the folks said their systems didn't give them good data. And to me, having a background in systems, that's shocking, and it's also unconscionable that the systems themselves aren't doing that, right? And I think that's an important point to understand is sometimes the very systems that we're using don't do a great job of that. And that's a challenge. Also, folks are busy. That's what I come back to when I said earlier, this is hard. This is a discipline. So busyness can get in the way of that. But the outcome of that is by not incorporating those metrics and data processes early on, you run the risk of being very busy, but not as effective because you've got a lot of purposeless activity. Yeah, go
But I
ahead.
want to push on that for a second. Do you think, I mean, I'm sorry, I'm thinking about all of the NACE conversations and meetings where companies talk about their data and they highlight things. This is our cost per hire, or this is the number of applicants we get, or applicant mix. Do companies think they're using data really well, or do they recognize that they might not be leveraging it as much as they could? Does that question
Um,
make sense?
Yeah, no, I think it varies. So what you just described, or what I would call sort of like table stakes, is one friend of mine often refers to. It's like the baseline. It's what we should be measuring as recruiting professionals. And so whether you're doing it through your system, whether you're doing it through manual calculations, whatever, it gives you some of those baselines. But at the end of the day, you have to also be asking the question, what are you really measuring? If you're are the things you're measuring actually relating back to outcomes? Are they giving you the opportunity to see where things could be improved? Are they showing you where there's a real impact to the organization? I think that is the reason why sometimes metrics maybe aren't utilized as much, or perhaps aren't taken to the next level, is because they're not focusing on the metrics. So, say for example, things number of applicants, conversion rates, cost per hire. Those are all things that at least I grew up with. But what do they really mean to somebody outside of the organization? Also, is it really worth having a low cost per hire if it's not translating into retention? So you have to be looking at just not what the metrics are, but relaying those to other aspects of the organization or other aspects of the processes that also are important, so that you don't come to the conclusion that you got great cost per hire metrics, but at the expense of retention or at the expense of quality, right? Those things go hand in hand. So you have to be using these things, and it's almost like as one person once said, it's like a stew. You throw lots of ingredients together, and you have to be mindful of how much salt, how much pepper, how many other things you're doing. Because if you don't have the right balance, your stew's not going to come out quite as great. And it's just like that in recruiting, and from a metrics and a data perspective, it's bringing all those different things together to come out with something that looks really good and really helps the organization along.
Well, and do you know what's interesting as you're saying that? Again, what's jumped out as me is, and I haven't been in this space as long as you, is historically, even as recent as 5, 6, 7 years ago, it seemed really, really hard for early career teams to actually apply the lessons learned from the data because of the traditional process. So even if they had the data suggesting that maybe we should be doing more with schools we're not going to, or maybe we should be looking beyond certain majors, or maybe like whatever that data was telling them, the ability to actually experiment to see if they could improve was heavy, because you had to go to campus. You had to be at the career. It's a $10,000 investment at least each time you show up at a career fair. Or if you wanted to experiment with a different type of hire than you normally did, if you wanted to, the data was showing you that maybe GPA is not a good predictor. It seems so high stakes to experiment and figure out if that data were, or if the data were valid or not. And it seems like over the past several years, I mean, campus recruiting teams have so many more arrows in their proverbial quiver that they can play around and actually impact that, impact it to fit and experiment in low cost, low stakes ways that don't require 12 months of foresight. Are you seeing some of that?
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, look, when you lay out a plan for a program, right, you have to be thinking about all these different things, the cost involved, the logistics of getting your people, not just the people who report to you, but the people that help support you. You have to think about budgets. So it's a tremendous amount of inertia that you have to overcome to get these recruitment plans to actually be executable. And then once that's all in place, again, using the term inertia, it's going to be difficult to change because most of us who've been doing this know that it takes a good 2 years, if not more, to begin to see how the brand that you're trying to create is actually being interpreted amongst the students or the faculty, whoever you're trying to influence, right? And how your interns that you might have brought in are telling the stories when they go back on. It takes time, in other words. So you can't just
Hmm.
change these things. Now, that was the past. Now, what we see coming in the last probably 5, probably maybe even 10 years is the advent of technology at all different levels. So, for
But
example, go ahead.
the silver lining of COVID. I mean, the reality. Sorry, I didn't mean to
Absolutely.
interrupt.
No, absolutely. COVID was sort of the accelerator for changing processes. But prior to that, I'll use Yellow, my old company, right? Yellow brought in a tremendous flexibility using technology by the mere fact that it could accelerate how things got done. It got rid of paper, right? It made things a lot easier. So again, logistically, things got easier. Information got a lot easier. Point is that the technology allowed things to happen more quickly than it had in the past, and arguably at a lower cost. It also injected things like metrics. COVID really accelerated the advent of virtualization, being able to do something from a distance and not having to be tied geographically, right? So it taught a lot of people the old paradigms weren't set in stone. They weren't sacred cows. They were actually able to be changed. Now, some of that since COVID is reversed. We've all seen companies and students really gravitate back to being on campus. But for the most part, most of what didn't exist 10 years ago now exists in the form of multiple sources of data. You can get data from Way Up, from Ripple Match, from any number of sources, right? You don't have to go just to a career center to get access to students. So getting information has been significantly easier. And why is that all important? It factors into how your strategy actually ends up developing. You have multiple different channels of information, multiple different channels of candidate input that come into it. And to your point, Jeffrey, much of this is at a much lower cost. And because it is happening in near real time, it gives you also the ability to change on the fly. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't even say Parker Dewey, right? Parker Dewey is a great example of being able to adjust on the fly by incorporating an alternative strategy using projects to help identify students, to have those students be brought into the mix. So my point is that there's multiple different ways now that organizations can execute on the strategy. And it always comes back to the data and measuring it to figure out which of those strategies is actually having impactful outcomes. And by the way, sometimes impact is not cheap. It's better to be cost effective, but to do it in a way where there's impact rather than be cheap or frugal and not see the kind of outcomes, right? So we're not always talking about necessarily being cheap. We're talking about really understanding where the money is going, the resources are going, and if we're getting outcomes from that.
And I want to double underline something you said because it's interesting. We talk about being on campus. One thing, and Mary Scott has a bunch of research on this, as do others. There is still real benefit to employers for being on campus. There is real benefit to building the relationships with the schools. And it's about using the data to figure out how to do that more effectively, not replacing those aspects, not replacing the authenticity. So again, it's worth highlighting. One thing I want to dive into something because again, one of the things that I hear a lot from employers, and I think you're bringing this up as well, is we want to bring data into the conversation. We want to use it more. We want to start to see the impact, yes, the 2 year impact, but also the shorter term sort of impacts. Are there any suggestions or best practices you've seen through your long and illustrious career on the right or most effective process to start to bring data in to the organization and for the early career teams to ultimately take control of the data, to get the executives focused on the right data?
Yeah, for me at least, I've sort of, if you will, stumbled on this a long time ago when, frankly, I had to talk to a CEO about my program. It was a company that was spinning up their college program, And my boss at the time said, "Hey, we're going to go present to the CEO because he's really vested in this university process." And I was, at that time, my career pretty early, and I was petrified to some extent. I'm like, what am I going to do? And what I focused on was actually not just taking what was in my head, but laying out a plan. And I'll use the term a strategic plan. So the very first thing before you even think about data is to create a plan that helps articulate what you're doing and why you're doing it, right? It helps you define, first of all, what's the destination? Where are you going and why are you going there? And again, using analogies, whenever we if you have kids or folks in a car and you tell them you're going to Disney World or Disneyland, they're going to be excited about that. They also are going to be much more willing to be on board with what you ask because they understand the destination. So the plan is the first thing to start with. It helps you identify the aspects of, what are the goals for the organization? Are your goals, i.e., going to particular schools or the number of schools, in line with what the organization's looking for?
Well, and
Also, go ahead.
can I
Yeah,
just
please.
focus on that for 1 second? Because I think it's really important, and I hadn't thought about that before. So while we or those involved in early career programs might care about how many schools we went to or how many applicants we have, at the end of the day, it's making sure to really start with what are these corporate goals and objectives, and then building your plan into that. Is that a fair way of phrasing what?
Absolutely. And so, for example, is the goal of the organization to create a talent pipeline, truly a talent pipeline that helps fill hard to find positions? Is it going to fill positions that are leadership focused, right? It's what is the goal, and is the organization on board with that? And by the way, I've worked for companies that had phenomenal training programs, development programs, as they were called. One in particular was really interesting because it created some of the best accounting and financial development graduates of the program. The challenge was the folks coming out of this development program had no place to go. And as a result of that, they were scooped up by the competition because competition knew about that. So there was a clear case where the organization was exceptionally good at getting the talent in the door, getting things, getting things in place to get them trained, to give them phenomenal training. But it didn't map back to something that the organization had bought into, which was again the receptacle of that talent. It was a gap, and so the plan, or the point of the plan, is to make sure not only are you doing what you need to do, but is everybody else on board? Is your specific leadership team on board? Is the leadership team that's the recipient of your output, that is the talent, are they
So
on board?
So when I see, and again, we've all seen the LinkedIn posts from people in early career recruiting where their jobs have been cut and they're looking for work, is the opportunity to almost mitigate that, making sure that the early career program is viewed as core to whatever the larger corporate goal is.
I think there certainly can be a component of that, right? I think, again, if we come back to what I said earlier, a lot of this traces back to folks are new to this thing called recruiting, perhaps new to college recruiting, and aren't yet on board with the very things that need to be done to help the organization understand how what they do translates and maps to outcomes down the road. Remember, they're bringing in a college hire or an intern. The output of that isn't going to be known for probably minimum of a year, but several years. And if you're not tracing that through, or your organization hasn't done that, it's harder to defend when budgets get cut. So,
Right.
absolutely, doing this helps to some extent ensure that those around you that are outside of your influence or your ability understand what you're doing it, why you're doing it, and how it maps to their success, and how their success in terms of talent is tied to what it is you're doing. In other words, it helps, I think, mitigate sometimes knee-jerk reactions, because if you look at it from an expense point, college recruiting is expensive. And so if you're looking to cut, it's a natural place to cut. But if you've set it up correctly and you've helped identify how what you're doing maps to these larger issues, there may be less of a chance of the cuts, or perhaps not being as extensive. So again, that's I think one way to look at it and help mitigate when those kinds of things do happen.
No, and again, it's really important. I mean, this is, again, I'm thinking of the example you gave with the company where they had a great pipeline, they trained well, but because it wasn't as integrated into the longer term talent needs of the company, it puts it at risk. So once you understand those corporate goals, what then? What's the next way, or the corporate data, or the data that aligns to the corporate goals? What's sort of the next step for folks that want to start using the data? Does that question
I
make sense?
think, yeah, it does. And I think, so let's go back to the plan, right? If you set up your goals and your objectives, the key there is to set up metrics that align to those goals and that allow you to actually measure them, right? So the very critical step is to not just have the plan, but to have the plan incorporate metrics. And by the way, when I did my initial plan many years ago, I didn't have that because I wasn't a big fan yet at that time of data, didn't really understand it. So I had lots of activity, but I hadn't put in place the measurements of that activity, and particularly the measurements that equated to more long-term outcomes, which is why I today really focus on that. So the very first step is making sure that you plan. I think we're going to share with folks at the end of the session some examples of that. So we won't get into the weeds on that. But it's very important to focus on measuring the things that you do. So that would be critical. Now, with that said, you know, it's very easy to get wrapped up in metrics and tout them and bring them into a presentation. But the reality is, once you get outside of your team, no one really cares about your metrics. Let me give you an example. If recently I wanted to buy a vacuum, a shop vac to be exact. And if you're looking at a vacuum, it tells you things like horsepower and cubic feet per minute, whatever. That's all good and well, but what do you really care about as a buyer of that vacuum? If it cleans, right? And by the way, does it clean well on a carpet? Does it clean well on a bare floor? It's the same from an executive point of view. It's the same from people who are receiving the outcome. They care about different things. And so it's important for folks who are going down this journey of giving, discipline to the process and metrics, to think about the recipients differently than you would do for your own teams. So that's the second, I think, most important step, which is to really focus on changing your language to be impact focused rather than outcome focused, rather than measuring transactions. That's probably the best way to do that. Internally, when you're talking to teams, you're measuring transactional types of things. When you talk externally to leadership, to other members of the organization, you're talking about impact. And that's a different, if you will, way to approach that.
But I agree with that, but I'm still trying to get my arms around how we do that in early career. How do we show the impact of what we're doing in a way that a CFO, a CEO, a CHRO recognizes how vital it is?
I think you start looking at, for example, um, how effective students are, for example, that may have a sales background from a particular program or programs, plural, right? And how their efforts contribute more to sales than students from a different discipline or lack of that program, right? It's about drilling down into the details and saying something as simple as, look, as 80% of the sales that we see success come from 20% of the students that we're recruiting from these various programs. I care about that. First of all, it means I can certainly reduce some of the activity in other areas, but it also helps me understand that if we're getting that much of a uplift in terms of productivity and goals being hit from these areas, first thing we do is we don't cut those areas. If anything, we expand on that. So
So
it's, go ahead.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, it's just it's about, again, drilling down into what matters to the folks outside, and try and sometimes just asking it, right? But it's more about focusing on the impact that going to certain schools, recruiting from certain programs, using certain vendors, for example, Parker Dewey approach, all have different outcomes, and being able to measure those and then being able to tell the story why those things are actually important. Because remember, when you get to the executive level, the thing you got to keep in mind is nobody's going to do the work to figure the story out. That's not what executives do. Executives are looking at impact, they're looking at options. You have to do that work. You have to tell that story, the story you want them to hear. And I think that's the important thing when you talk about impact metrics is you've thought about it, you've understood what's important to them, and you're communicating those things to them.
Well, the other thing that you're hitting on, it's a metaphor an old boss you sort of shared with me a while ago, is it's using the GPS versus the rear view window or the rear view mirror. So I think so many times it's metrics, and I'm actually thinking about a company in particular where they were focused on gender equity. And historically, we're tracking things like, are we seeing enough gender equity, yes or no? And the HR team was showing a slightly increasing line, which was good. Again, but that was very much the rear view mirror approach. And then one of the things they did was they started to look into the data differently. They saw that, and again, I'll make up the numbers because I can't remember the exact one. 60% of their applicants were female, but they were only selecting 55% for internships and full-time roles, and they were better able to understand the root cause. The root cause was not getting enough applicants or enough interest, which is where most of the recruiting efforts were focused beforehand, but rather I'll call them unintentional biases or other causes within the higher decision-making process. So the company was able to, again, use this data and focus very specifically on certain types of training and engaging certain ERGs, et cetera. And they were able to find that they were still getting 55% of their applicants were female, but 60 or 65 or 70% selected were female. So again, it's that changing of the use of the data from that sort of rear view mirror to the windshield or to the GPS.
Uh, I mean, yeah, absolutely. Another thing that you have to keep in mind if you're in this business is recruiting is often sort of the recipient of everything that's not going well, right? Yeah, the candidates you're bringing in aren't the right quality, or why is it taking so long, or any number of other kinds of criticisms that the businesses might have, you know, and whether they're justified or not. So having this kind of approach we've talked about helps mitigate and frankly protect the team from some of those things. To your point, when you can show that the input has been not only great but growing, but yet the outcome in the decision making process is where things are breaking down. Now you can sort of get to that root cause and say, all right, it's not a supply issue necessarily, it's a process issue. Is that the people that are involved in the decision making process need more training? Is it a process whereby even though the some of the things are in place, but there are elements that are missing. All of these things come into play to give recruiting early talent the ability to both defend itself and where it's necessary be able to make changes in their process, but to do it from a database perspective so that it's not an emotional perspective. And by the way, all of us in early talent know that this often is very emotional because folks who love to get involved in the process, particularly if it's their alma mater, right, will use a lot of the analogies of, well, it was a good school for me, therefore we got to keep going there. So it helps defend against sometimes these emotional reasons for making decisions and actually focus it back on, no, this makes sense or this doesn't make sense.
Well, and this goes back to, and again, you've heard this story, and I apologize for anyone else who has. I mean, this goes back to why I founded Parker Dewey a decade ago. That again, we were getting tons of candidates. Thought we were doing all the right things with behavioral interviews and all of those other things. Um, but we weren't seeing the conversion rate or the performance rate or all of this other stuff. But it was really difficult to change because there were so few slots we had to hire for and so few opportunities to experiment. And that's kind of why I like this concept of the project-based sort of recruiting and the experiential recruiting and the use of these real projects, because you can get this real-time data in an actionable low stakes way.
Yeah. So let's talk about that for example, or for a moment, because I think what folks need to understand, and this, whether you're doing it early into the profession or been there for a while, recruiting is high risk. Right? By definition, you are making bets on people. And so the goal of recruitment is to de-risk the process. It is to make the bet as safe as possible. You'll never have it perfect because at the end of the day, we're talking about people. And so anything you can do to de-risk the process of making decisions is a good thing. Now let's talk about campus recruiting for a second in terms of trying to de-risk that. You're relying on a resume, which these days is highly gamified from the standpoint of tech. You've got AI helping folks level set their resumes to a much, much better level than ever before. You've got coaching going on. So in the process of early talent, when you're relying on a resume, an hour or 2 hours worth of an interview, and frankly, not a whole lot else, you're taking a big bet at the end of the day, right? Now, some companies inject more into that, but at the end of the day, it's a bet that you're placing. So what all of us need to think about is how do we hedge our bet that it's the safest way to do that? Well, you do that one way by injecting more data, not just a process standpoint, but an evaluation. Therein lies part of the problem because the evaluation data you want is often tied up in things like GPA, which, frankly, most of us who've done this for a while realize that GPAs don't always correlate to success. You're trying to do that based on grades. There's a lot of issues with that. So on and on and on. So what are you left with? Well, at the end of the day, if you don't incorporate different strategies or alternatives, you're not left with a whole lot of opportunities. That's where I think you guys represent an incredible opportunity that's frankly been a well-kept secret because you call them micro-internships, but they're really micro projects that students can take advantage of. So for those of you on the call who may not be familiar, it's really fantastic because what you're allowed to do here is to give these students work-related projects. By the way, the students are paid, so there's a lot of incentive for students to participate, and then actually create work-related outcomes that you can measure. And just something as simple as their communication skills, both in terms of written and in terms of verbal, being on a call, attention to detail, the degree to which that they put in effort. So there's so many different aspects of data and intelligence that come into these micro internships that, Jeffrey, to your point, circle back to a flexible way to be able to inject information that helps you de-risk the process, get better at extending invitations, get better at making sure the folks you want in the process are actually in the process.
And I hadn't thought about it in the way you just said it, but it's really interesting because it's the ability, the short-term nature of the projects lets you apply, use, collect, refine the programmatic data. So are there certain schools, certain majors? Should we be engaging different populations? You can measure the effectiveness of the process itself and course correct or refine, but it's also data on the individual candidate. And again, anyone who's been around me has heard me use this metaphor, which was a lot less creepy when it was a college student versus a 40-something married guy saying it. But the process historically has been broken because, to your point, I'm hiring someone for a summer internship. That is a 10, 15, $20,000 bet. And I'm doing it, it's essentially getting engaged with very, very little data. Or I'm hiring someone for a full-time role, which is an even bigger bet. These projects almost let people go on those dates beforehand, where the work product itself is almost secondary. It's about getting data. It also, I guess, goes back to the same way that we hire experienced professionals. Again, if someone was hiring me, they could look at my LinkedIn profile or my resume and see the bullet points of what I've actually accomplished in my professional career and can start to make those judgments. And I am able to communicate the skills that are relevant to the job in an interview setting. With college students and recent grads, that just doesn't exist. Again, to your point, all they have really is academic pedigree and maybe a summer job or two.
Exactly. And, in the professional world, it's not uncommon when you're interviewing somebody to perhaps ask them to to do a mini case study, right? To do something that becomes an evaluation part of the process. I did that for an organization not too long ago. But on the student side, it's not going to happen, generally speaking, unless you're a well-known brand where everybody's, dying to work for you. If you ask a student to go and do this, I
Well,
think there's going to be a lot of silence, right? Um, and that's
but
where
you also
Parker Dewey really shines. Go ahead.
no, and I appreciate that. You also I'm smiling because we used to do that. Again, when I was in finance, we used to do at the end of the process. So we
Mm,
screened resumes, we did phone screens, we invited people in for interviews, and after investing God knows how many hours, then we took the last 10 candidates and had them do that case study. And again, it works if you have the right brand, but even if you get them to do it, and even if they're willing to do it, think about how much time we invested in actual time,
right.
interviewing and screening and everything else. If we could have front loaded that, that would have been pretty powerful.
Yeah. And you bring up a great point, which I forgot to mention earlier on. So, we talked about the plan, but a plan incorporates a budget. Now, most folks who do a budget are going to go ahead and take into account all of the hard costs, right? They're going to plan for travel, logistics, hotels, cars, all that kind of stuff. And that's foundationally what you should be doing. The very few, if any, are going to take time to plan the next big line item, which is the cost of staff to come support this. I'm not talking about the recruiters on the team. If you're an organization that brings folks in your company into the process, especially if you're going on campus, there's a cost to that. There's an opportunity cost to that, and it has to be or should be calculated. So where am I going with this? Well, years ago, I had somebody tell me that a college hire was the cheapest hire we'd ever make as a company, and that's absolutely false. Most folks, I don't think, realize that to hire an intern in a sizable program, say 100 or more, although the costs don't vary too much, you're looking at just for the programmatic costs about $20,000 for those 8 or 10 weeks. If you add in the acquisition cost, that is the cost to bring people into that cost jumps up another $6,000, $7,000, right? So you're talking $25,000 to $30,000 to bring in an intern to convert them hopefully to full time. First of all, I challenge anybody to have that conversation with their CFO because I don't think CFOs really understand that.
Wait, hold on.
It's
I just want to make sure I understand. 25,000 per intern?
correct. Think about a program of 100 candidates, just the salary load of taking 100 folks for 10 weeks, 8 weeks, whatever the program load is, just salary alone. Add into that the transportation costs if you bring them in for an event, if you're giving sign-on bonuses or housing, any number of other things. So just those costs alone will average about 18 to 20,000. I did the math. I
Yeah.
actually have a calculator for that, right? But again, I want to stress this doesn't include the cost to get to that point, the campus visits that are also part of that equation. This is just for the 10 weeks. So you have this incredible cost to get talent. And it circles back to why data and why metrics are so important is because the cost of failure, getting it wrong, is exceptionally high. So again, I just want to say it's not the cheapest hire an organization will ever make. In fact, I'd argue it's probably one of the more expensive. That doesn't mean you do away with it because there's an incredible value to bringing early talent in to foundationally change things in the organization, to add new skills, right? You don't just throw the baby in the bathwater out and go, so, no, but you should do it in a way that you understand what's at stake. And more importantly, I think there's another opportunity is to provide alternative strategies. Don't put all your eggs in the basket of a traditional internship. They're great. My son had one. I'm a big fan of them. But
Me
I think
too.
where Parker Dewey shines is being able to provide parallel path, if you will, to get to the same point. Remember, it's about the destination. It gives you the ability to evaluate talent, to get additional skills, to get additional metrics about performance, and to do it, frankly, at a far, far less expensive cost per acquisition and broader reach. I don't think folks really get the fact that with Parker Dewey, if you submit a project, you have exposure to literally thousands of universities at no additional cost. That boggles my mind that you can post a project. and get it exposed to students all across the country for no more than if you're doing it at just one of your core schools. And so that, automatically helps you bring in greater diversity, not just in terms of the traditional metrics, but also the individuals that are coming in from a different program, different schools of thought, different ways that they approach it from their institution. So again, it's my point is simply that you should be thinking not just about doing it one way, but bringing alternative strategies. And again, measuring the outcomes of those to see which of those strategies is actually paying you the greatest dividends.
So first of all, thank you for the kind words about Parker Dewey, and I certainly
You're welcome.
appreciate
You've
that.
earned it.
Now, but I'm a math guy, and you have me thinking. And again, I hadn't thought about the numbers until you were just saying this. So let's take the low end. Let's assume it's $20,000 is your fully loaded cost of a summer intern. Let's just, again, because my math skills aren't what they once were, let's say you convert 50% of them to full-time hires. And again, there's going to be companies that are higher, companies that are lower, whatever. That means that your effective cost per hire is not 20,000, but it's 40,000.
Correct.
And again, if you have a 100-person intern class, that's a $2 million annual cost to bring in 50 full-time people. Now, while you might be able to get your, and while that, again, correct me if I'm wrong, if a campus recruiter historically said, I can get my conversion rate from 50% to 60%, they feel really good about it. It's amazing, but the CFO doesn't necessarily care. But if they could go to that CFO and say, I was able to save us $500,000 because I was able to bring in more of the right interns, because, and again, they're not framing it as increasing my conversion rate from 10% to 60%, but they're able to show I lowered our cost by $250,000, $500,000, then all of a sudden they care. Is that fair? Am I thinking about it the right way?
Absolutely. I mean, again, if you can go to any leadership team member and say you're either making money for the organization or saving money, they're always going to be interested because that's it. At the end of the day, that's what business is all about. And I think what we have here is the way we've always done things, right? Traditionally, the way we've gone about recruiting early talent, put virtualization aside for a second, is we do this traditional experiential program called the internship or co-op, and it's great, has tremendous benefits and tremendous outcomes. But it's a very expensive process. Now, it's all well and good when things are great and we've got budget and everybody is on the same page, but we all know if we've been in this business for a long time, it goes in cycles. And particularly when things get challenging, when budgets get cut, or the organization is asking for you to do more with less, that's when you have to be really creative, right? But it shouldn't have to come to that point. So if you're able to go to the organization and say, look, I've done the math. I know that our acquisition cost of getting folks to the door is 20,000. Remember, that's the acquisition cost of the talent coming to the party and spending those 10 weeks with you. But you really don't care just about that. You care about the folks that stay after the party to come and do things, right? Accepting the offer. So if you're going to go to the executive and you have that conversation, like it's $20,000 to bring them to the party. If they stay, it's $40,000. I think I can do better. And here's how I think I can do better. And I can do it at a far less cost. I can do it in a way that brings us closer to the goals that we have, whether that be diversity or hard to find positions. I can get more exposure. And oh, by the way, I'll make it even sweeter. The offer acceptance rate is also going to be a lot higher. It's going to be that 90% range. Because remember, the folks that have come and done projects are getting exposure to the organization, get exposure to the culture, exposure to right? That all is working for you. So I can't think of a member of the leadership team that would say anything but bless you, please go, let's make this happen and get back to me with those outcomes. I think it's a fantastic value prop.
And the whole key to all of this goes back to where you started the conversation. It's presenting the data in a way that managers, executive business leaders actually care. They don't care about the vanity metrics. They don't care about sort of the pat yourself on the back or what awards. What they really care about is what's our cost? What's the hiring effectiveness? Are we hitting certain goals that matter to them, and really focusing on that? You mentioned, and again, I have to ask this question because again, of the amount of time you spend at Yellow, and I'm a huge fan, even from the days it was Rex Solo. Um, yeah, you haven't heard that name in a while, huh?
No, I still have my t-shirts.
I think I may also. Um, Companies have made some big investments. And again, in some cases they're questioning whether or not they have. And we hear from a lot from companies like, why am I spending 100, $200,000 a year for sort of lists of names or to blast emails? But there's companies that have these systems, certain systems like Yellow embedded, which is really good. How can how can things like micro internships be aligned with those investments those organizations have already made?
Well, again, I think it's keeping in mind it's part of a strategy, right? It's you're not putting all your eggs in one basket. So if you think about Yellow for an example, what it does at the core is it makes your operational processes more efficient. It gives you the ability to collect data more efficiently, to capture your notes and things, right? But and within that, by the way, are some phenomenal metrics because that's what we focused on. We really understanding what was going on. But what it kind of stops there. It's a data collection tool, and it's very good at what it does. Where I think a Parker Dewey type strategy comes into play is allowing, for example, an added layer of brand awareness. So, for example, I'll just again, because I know the Yellow system, using Yellow and its ability to push information out about the projects that might take place. So, if you're a company and you don't have much of a brand on campus and you're concerned because typically at your career fairs, you're not getting a lot of visibility. What a great way to use a tool like Yellow or other things you may have your CRM systems to embed a QR code that leads those students who didn't know about it to your projects. And so you go from a company that no one thought about before, because let's face it, folks, everybody has a limited attention span, including me, and you're going to focus on things that you think are important to you. But if you're able to push out information simply because somebody stopped by your booth or you had a QR code there at your
Hmm.
table that leads them to the project, now all of a sudden I go from, hey, I never heard of this company to, well, they've got some really interesting projects that they do. Because remember, these projects are not make work. They are tied to actual things that the organization might do, the kinds of challenges that they have, problems they're trying to solve. And now as a student, I go from didn't really have an interest to this is an interesting company vis-a-vis their projects are interesting, the people I talk to. So to me, that's a great way to use existing talent to just leverage what is now a great way to spread the word that not only are we a great company, but we do great things and we have great projects that we could bring you to.
Well,
That's
and I
one
want to
thing I
hit
could think about.
I want to hit two things on that. First of all, 100%. Smith Nephew Medical Device Company last year talked about how they went to Nesby. And I don't know if they use Yellow or not, so I can't comment on the integration. But they went to Nesby, and at the career fair booth, all they were doing was talking about the micro internships. And it was great because these students could leave the career fair and immediately go apply. And it was this great way to keep the candidates warm before the summer internship, before, and again, for the freshmen and sophomores, before they could apply. But it was also a catalyst to drive them to the career fair booth instead of just hearing, again, in Allison's words, the standard pitch and the standard story that they could find on the website. They actually were driven to the booth because they knew, if I show up at this booth, I'll have an opportunity to work on this real paid project. The second thing, and I want to touch on something in the chat, you hit on something earlier, that the student has to be really, really motivated and willing to do potentially unpaid work like case studies or simulations. That's really important because we've seen a lot. Like, if I know I want to work at XYZ company and I'm 100% certain, maybe I'm willing to go do that case study to get in the door. But the vast majority of students aren't sure. And again, our annual student sentiment survey shows this. They want to explore, they want to look beyond. The other thing it does with these unpaid work is it potentially actually hurts your employer brand. And it potentially actually limits students because, again, if I am a student working part time to pay for bills, am I really willing to and able to invest 10, 20, 30 hours to do an unpaid simulation to maybe possibly have a chance of being interviewed? And again, they're great in certain circumstances and to the extent they're tied into the classroom curricula, but it's just something to keep in mind, again, as we think about really building that employer brand and the type of signaling it sends to the students.
Yeah, yeah, I couldn't agree more. First of all, it should not be allowed that students work for free, right? I don't care. Interns, whether they're getting academic credit or not, should always be paid for work something. And in the case of your projects, I think what you've told me is they typically are in the $20 to $25 an hour range. That's, well within the range of what most interns, if they're working in an intern project, would get. So first point is, this is going to be a great way to bring folks into your your talent pool, your funnel at an incredibly cost-effective price point, right? $25 times 10 hours is 250. Average projects somewhere between 250 to 400, and you're getting 10, students doing real work, getting things done. Try to find a way to get your brand established for $4,000. Because remember, those students, and one thing we love about college or hate, depending on which side of the equation you're on, is it's a great way for stories to be told. If you're a student and you're interacting with a company and you're meeting great people and you're doing some interesting work and you're getting, vested in the story of that organization, are you going to keep it to yourself? No, you're going to tell your roommate at a minimum, but you're probably going to tell some folks, student clubs and organizations. So my point is, these projects aren't just about getting stuff done. They're about creating outcomes which are, incredibly inexpensive relative to everything else you would try to do. And they're doing it in a very authentic way because the students aren't getting a document that was created by an ad agency that's full of lots of words and things. This is about real stuff that the students care about at a ridiculous price point.
Yeah, and to be clear, I am a believer in any form of experiential learning that helps students explore, helps them build upon sort of what they're learning in the classroom, helps create a catalyst to build their network and relationships. I think we just always need to be aware of sort of the unintended consequences. And when something's being used purely as skill building and a lot like that's wonderful, but to the extent something creates an additional obstacle for learners, that's where we start sort of beyond the social and moral aspects of it. It's where we start limiting our pool. It's where we start
Yeah.
potentially missing out on great candidates the same way if we only recruit from certain schools or have GPA filters.
Right. And it comes back to being part of a multi-pronged strategy to accomplish your goals or frankly get to your destination. So by no means are we saying eliminate. What we're saying is augment, bring
Yeah.
in a strategy that helps. Parker Dewey being one of those. The reason I get sort of passionate about it is because I didn't know about Parker Dewey in detail until just a short time ago when I started to really peel back the layers. And what I got so excited about was the recruiting impact, because that's where, as a recruiting director, I care about the vendors. Are the vendors, the technologies, the processes, whatever, are they going to have impact to me? And when I fully recognize the impact to my recruitment, which is I'm able to de-risk my process. I'm able to get not just the right students, but a greater variety of students from schools that I can't afford to recruit at. Because again, if most of us aren't going to be in a position of having unlimited budgets or budgets that allow us to go to 20 core schools. We have to be exceptionally frugal with that. And what Parker Dewey allows you to do, expand that universe at a very cost-effective way and gives you access to incredible talent at these organizations that you normally wouldn't get to. Remember, it's not about them applying to you, because if they don't know about you, they won't apply to you. This is about getting their attention through these great projects, which then leads to these other outcomes.
Well, on that note, I think we got a lot of the questions that were asked beforehand. Sorry if we didn't get to any from the chat or otherwise. Steve, I could talk to you for hours. You have just
Likewise.
such deep expertise in the space. Maybe we'll have to do an after hours or follow up on this. This was great. Um, again, my big takeaway, two big types of data about the candidates themselves, data with the process, and it's focusing on how to use the data in a way that executives and other internal and external stakeholders care about. Not the data that necessarily helps us tactically understand our process, which is obviously important, but also the data that gives us the air cover for those difficult times, the data that continues to demonstrate the value of what we do, the data that help us make better decisions. And anything we can do to get more data and use it more effectively, the positive. Again, as always, thank you everyone for joining. Really, really excited. My colleague Lindsay is sharing a couple of QR codes for some updated or some upcoming events. So we have a session on data-driven recruiting. I believe it's next Tuesday. I hope you can join. Again, like always, register. Even if you can't make it, you'll get the recording and slides. We also have that recruiting metrics cheat sheet with some best practices on those key metrics. And again, to the extent anyone has questions, whether it's from the university side, employer side, anyone else, feel free to use the QR code to, again, book time with folks on the Parker Dewey team. Steve, thank you again. You are, again, and I know the term thought leader and expert is sort of thrown around, especially on LinkedIn,
Hmm.
but you are a true thought leader and expert around early career recruiting and how to use data for good and in impactful way. So thank you for joining us today, and thanks for all the ongoing support.
My pleasure, Jeffrey. Always great to be here. And if anyone does have questions, I'm on LinkedIn. Feel free to reach out. I'll do my best to answer any questions and engage. Thanks so much.
With that, this concludes the webinar. Happy everything between now and the end of the year. And thank you everyone for joining and for all of the ongoing support.
Thank you.